Hello and welcome to the Odd Couple Podcast. This is Siddhartha.
And I'm Dr. Ashish.
So today with us we have Ramnath Vaidyanathan. Ram heads the environmental sustainability for Godrej Industries and Associate Companies and is responsible for driving the group's green strategy. He has 12 years of experience in the sustainability sector across a wide range of roles, from regulatory policies to process engineering, operations strategy, advisory, business development, business strategy, and product development and management. Oh my God, Ram, you've been busy. So prior to Godrej, Ram was the CEO of Wish Energy Solutions, a renewables energy subsidiary of the Ensign Group. Prior to that, he worked for the water treatment technology and developing policy and regulations for drinking water at the National Environment Agency in Singapore. Wow, Ram, I think we are honored to have somebody in the whole green space and doing so much, and half of it I couldn't pronounce and majority of it I don't understand. So welcome to the Odd Couple Podcast.
Thank you guys. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I wish parents had also thought of it in the same way, saying that we're so proud of you doing this rather than investment banking. But it is what it is, a different kind of green, that's all.
Exactly.
That's true.
Sustainability, as a subject, I'm glad that you guys are also picked up on it because it is quite the buzzword today. And I think it's good that the three of us are here to chat about this because we need to demystify and make it a little less complex.
Exactly. So that comes to my first question. What is sustainability? What is sustainable development and everything around it? Because it seems like a fairly simple term or terminology.
Yeah.
But when you get into it or when we try to read a little bit about it, I'm like, oh my God, there's a lot of reading to do. So let me just wait for Ram to explain the whole thing to me.
Sure. So I'm going to try and explain this with a little bit of a history context as well as to how we came about with this entire idea of sustainability. Now, just off the bat, in the common English language, to sustain means pretty much to survive. Now, when it first started, this is around the early 70s in the US is when the idea of environment and our impact on it and environmental degradation and pollution really came to the fore. Now, maybe it had something to do with the entire movement around liberalism and, feminism and anti-war, anti-capitalism. But there was a bit of a backlash against corporates and industries in the US that gave rise to the first set of environmental legislations, and which basically sought to limit the impact that companies would have on the environment. And was fairly basic to start off with, air pollution, water pollution, very basic stuff. Now, it has evolved over the last 50 years to something which is much more, I would say, comprehensive and holistic. It's not just about environment. I think that's one of the first things we need to get to. Because sustainability, it actually involves three components. It's environment, society, and governance. It comes to all three aspects, which is why you'll always hear about the triple bottom line approach and the tripod of sustainability. So what essentially, if I had to sum it up today, what it means is when you look at people and planet alongside profit. So we went through a long time where it was like, profit first and then people and planet. Then, the entire environmental movement happened. They said, no, people and planet before profit. And that's where the sustainable development part comes. It's not just sustainability. It's how do we continue to thrive? How do business continue to prosper, make more products, continue to basically help their shareholders seek value. At the same time, minimizing their impact on environment and society. So when you look at, you'll often see it today, it's confused with, it's interchangeably used with the term ESG, environment, society, and governance. So what essentially has become today is that you have to look at the impact that companies, individuals, as well as governments and countries as a whole are having on each of these three factors, whether it's on the environment, whether it's on society or governance. The reason the development part is important in sustainable development, and people, this is where, it's very good to sometimes have the developing country lens on, because you can't just tell companies to stop manufacturing things or stop making things, because you have to understand that there is a growing population of people who need certain minimum requirements, who have certain minimum requirements. Let's just take an example of a soap. Now, soap is, essentially one of the biggest ingredients that go into it is something called palm oil. You must have heard about palm oil. Now, palm oil is one of the most hotly debated, contested raw materials in the world because a lot of it is linked to deforestation in Malaysia and Indonesia primarily. And it's pretty much the bedrock of most consumer goods. Now, in India, can we afford to say, no, we will not use palm oil? We will try and find a more expensive alternative to that? We can't do that because there is a huge bottom of the pyramid which depends on these products.
The demand is there.
Yeah, the demand is there and they need it. So, you might be solving the environment part of the problem, but then you have to look at the social part of it as well. This is where it's important. So it's important to look at all these categories. Just to give you, at Godrej, we have something, that's why it's called Good and Green, the program. It's not just green. So it's about the social impact and the environmental impact. So this in a nutshell is basically what we talk about sustainability.
Yeah, but Ram, when you were talking about sustainability and the evolution of how we've come across the idea of sustainability, you started with first, it started as, people going against corporates because of the pollution which was caused by, let's take oil for a matter of fact, during the early 70s and 80s, right? They had the fracking and which led to a lot of pollution, which then drew a lot of light onto it and seeing how it's affecting the environment. And that's how people got into it. But you also mentioned that today sustainability has evolved into taking the whole cause of being sustainable, right? Because we're not in an infinite world, we are in a finite world. So what I'd like to understand from you is, what are the different sustainability issues which we are facing globally and which are being
Sure.
tackled?
So it's a very good question, because it's sometimes difficult to narrow it down to what specific are the problem. But clearly, emissions is the biggest problem facing us, and that's the most commonly talked about one as well. So when you keep hearing about carbon neutrality pledges or a reduction in emissions, what they're essentially talking about is carbon. Just to very basic simplify it, it's very different from air pollution and emissions. They're two different things. Air pollution, like what happens in Delhi, for example, post Diwali and due to the agricultural crop burning, is what they're talking about is air pollution from a public health perspective, which is more about particulates, NOx, SOx, which is nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and the health effect it has. When they say emissions, what we're really talking about is purely about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide might not have a direct health impact on you, but it has an effect on something called greenhouse effect. You must have read about this in school as well. It basically increases the temperature of the earth. What then happens is that due to the increasing temperature, it affects almost everything. For example, the melting of the glaciers or the icebergs in the Arctic and the Antarctic, which basically adds more water in its liquid form into the ocean, so rising sea levels. When you have higher temperatures, you have differential pressure, so more tornadoes, hurricanes, adverse weather effects. The rainfall cycle changes.
Which we have been seeing of late in the last 2
Absolutely.
years or so,
In Bangalore, nobody's ever seen 40 degrees temperature till about a few years ago, because, and that is
Correct,
very much an effect of climate change. In fact, I would go as far as to say there is not a single city in India.
I just thought it was because I moved to Bangalore and then, Bangalore
hotness
just...
factor, the hotness factor increased.
Correct. But no. No, but recently in Canada, it was in the news that, they hit almost 50 degrees, and which is unheard of in the northern hemisphere to go up like that.
Absolutely.
So I think people are waking up to the idea that we have been affecting nature and nature's kicking back.
I think some people, I would still say, there is still, and this is mainly from the developed nations for some reason, there is still a little bit of pushback. Like if you'll hear, it's very difficult because it's not just the common people. When you have policymakers, like for example, when Donald Trump was the president of the US, he appointed a person to head the EPA and formulate the environment policies, who's a staunch climate denier, or who denies that climate change takes place. And he's a person who's been on the board of multiple oil companies. So when the so-called leader of the free world himself says that climate change is a myth and it's something created by the Chinese, that's a huge setback. That's a huge setback to the overall movement, because, developing countries obviously have, their own problems to deal with, and they're not really emitting close to as much as the US and Europe. And so they feel, okay, we are still on a development curve. Why is there a bigger onus on us to be sustainable as compared to, say, the US or the Western world in general, who basically adopted very reckless expansion curves in terms of industrialization, which has led us to the situation we're in today. So I think, it is very important. There is awareness, but there is backlash as well. You look at social media, you guys are very active on it. Greta Thunberg, when she says this, just read the comments below her tweets. There's often a lot of backlash saying that,
Correct.
You should stick to what you're peddling a globalist myth, George Soros, this, that. It becomes very difficult because, and it is not true that, there is an equal divide between scientists on this issue. And they say, there are both sides of the argument. Sometimes there are not both two sides to the argument. 97% of scientists agree that climate change, and this is the very important difference, man-made climate change.
But that's exactly which I was coming to, Ram, because biggest argument which is out there is that the earth naturally goes into cycles of climate change.
Yes.
So what is to say that this is purely man-made?
No, there are enough and more studies which have been done by scientists from across the world. Like I said, 97% of scientists have studied the data, have done the modeling, and the rise from the industrial era, from when industrial revolution took place, the scale at which it's increased is unparalleled in our history. There's a place called Mauna Loa in Hawaii. It's one of the most famous active volcanoes. The last time they checked the carbon dioxide, and the last time it was at this levels was, more than 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So we're almost hastening an ice age. And I think a lot of people get confused between climate change and the weather. They assume that just because, we say global warming means, why are we still having winters? This is literally what Trump said. Trump said, if it's snowing where I live, how come there's global warming?
Yeah.
And, we may laugh at it, but there are people who actually believe this sort of stuff. And we live in a, alternative facts post-truth era anyway. So it's very easy for someone to peddle this theory and for people to take them seriously. But if you listen to the science and you listen to the scientists, it's overwhelmingly in favor or supports the theory of man-made climate change. I don't want to bum people out, but the sad fact is, whatever's happened till now is almost irreversible. What we're doing right now is clearly trying to slow down the damage. To be very honest, it just sounds very morbid, but the damage that's been done over the last 200 years is catastrophic. And so that's only one part of it. You mentioned what are the other environmental issues. I haven't even touched upon things like water scarcity, which is one of the biggest issues. I mean, Sid, you're from Chennai, you would know the situation that happens in the summers, with the water tables. And I think a couple of years ago, we went to an emergency situation where there was literally no water.
Yeah.
So we've already reached that situation. It's not something that's there in the future.
And I think also the problem in India is that we keep hitting the groundwater, which over the long term is going to affect us even more badly. So, and even I think a city like Bangalore is also completely dependent on, the Kaveri. You take the Kaveri out and Bangalore is gone. There's no water anywhere. So,
and within 10 years, even that is supposed to dry out. Cape Town went through a really bad scene a couple of years back.
Yeah.
So it's happening more frequently.
Yeah, there are 3 or 4 main reasons for that as well. Of course, urbanization is the biggest issue. Like in terms of, if you see, Bangalore had more than 100 lakes at one point in time. Today we're left with a handful. And that's actually been like, it's land reclamation for building, residential properties and things like that. So your natural reservoirs, which keep your rainwater and rather than letting it run off, are not there anymore. So obviously, we're not able to, even if the rains happen, we're not able to collect that water. So that's one of the biggest issues. The other issue is that water is priced very, very ineffectively. At least the commercial and industrial water. This price is so low and so subsidized and doesn't take into account the true cost of water. The water is priced so low. I mean, when is the last time you saw your water bill? I mean, you'll hear people talk about the electricity bill, but when is the last time you actually even saw your water bill? Because you take it for granted because something's like almost insignificant.
Do we pay water bill?
It, I think, comes as part of a maintenance if you live in most apartment complexes.
But I see on a daily basis, especially during summers, because of summer holidays and stuff like that, and probably the more relatives coming over, we have like tanker lorries coming to apartment on hourly basis and filling it up. And the problem is that, yes, you might have some grey water management, you might have rainwater harvesting, but the conservation of water is not even a top of mind. You're like, Acha, theek hai, we won't, while shaving, we just let the water run. We're just so used to it.
What we don't realize is that, bringing that water back is very expensive. Like once it goes into the drainage, treating it and bringing it back is extremely expensive.
And what is happening now is that the tanker guys needs to go further and further away from the city to get the water. Hence, the water is becoming more expensive. But still, it's so cheap that we don't even realize it. At least the privileged few like us.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head there.
But you know what, Ram, what is really weird is that we've been driving this whole idea of, rainwater harvesting, etc. for, I think I've been hearing it for last, let's say 2 years or 3 years. So there's a lot of noise about it. But ultimately, I know that whatever rainwater is harvested is not used for our daily uses. It's used for watering the plants around or for the maintenance of the apartment, washing the car park, etc. So what is stopping us actually from using rainwater harvesting? Do you really require some certain amount of technology to do it, or why is there no further development in that?
It can be used. Grey water can be used for washing your clothes, for your toilet uses, for washing your cars. Absolutely. And in many apartments, they're doing that. They're collecting it and they use it for gardening, for example, or for common car park when they're doing the car wash and stuff. They use that. To treat it to drinkable standards, yes, you do need a bit of additional treatment. I mean, again, that's like, saying that, okay, we can't use it for drinking water means rainwater harvesting is of no use is a very, very narrow way to look at it, because there is still plenty of ways in which you can utilize it. And rainwater harvesting, but at the individual level or at the domestic level, is still a very small percentage. Industrial use of water, and of course, the elephant in the room, which no one wants to talk about, is agricultural use of water, which is actually, because unfortunately, it has become in such a way that the agriculture sector has become so politicized that, like, you can't criticize them or the army in India anymore, because they you can't say anything bad about them. But the truth of the matter is, our agricultural practices are very, very archaic. They need to be modernized. We're still using very, very water intensive, very fertilizer intensive, very, say unoptimal ways of producing our crops. If you take a country like Netherlands, for example, it's an extremely small country with severe water as well as landlocked. They have a problem with excess of water, and they have an issue with non-availability of land. But they have adopted practices such as vertical agriculture and modern farming techniques. They are now the second biggest food exporter in the world. I mean, just think about it. A country as small as, there was an article in The Economist, you can find it online. I mean, they are this tiny country that's feeding the world, the second biggest exporter of food in the world. You can imagine such a tiny country. And the way they did it was purely by modernizing agriculture. We have a lot of potential to do that. But that's the thing. I mean, our money, the direction of the money should not go towards subsidies. It should go towards modernizing the actual and giving the farmer the control of growing it in a better manner and giving them the education, which is what is happening in smaller pockets, but it's still one of the biggest drains on water. Maharashtra, for example, the interior parts of Maharashtra are extremely water starved or drought prone. Yet we continue to grow a lot of sugar there. Sugar is an extremely water intensive crop. Now, this is the classic example of profit before planet, because it's purely for the maximizing the profit that we continue to grow that there. Whereas the truth of the matter is probably overproducing. So I think, this is where, sometimes it can feel a bit disheartening, because you're saying that I am doing all this, water recycling and harvesting, but it doesn't seem to make an effect. But the real problems lie in the bigger sectors, not in the domestic use.
Absolutely, because I had read somewhere that 97% of the water conservation, if done by the bigger sectors like agriculture and industries, because we contribute only 3% wastage. But guys who are listening to us, that doesn't mean that you can run your tap on all the time and have long shower and stuff like that. No, it doesn't mean that. We need to be responsible too. But that's where it takes me to the next question. You're with conglomerate like Godrej, and you're heading the whole sustainable vertical of theirs. How are the bigger industries in India reacting to this, and what is it that you guys are doing?
That's a very good question, because when I joined Godrej, one of the reasons I did join the company is, historically, even before sustainability became a big issue, the Godrej family has always been known for being very, conservation conscious, as well as very, very conscious of the communities in which they impact. So a classic example is the mangroves in Mumbai. You must have heard about them. On the Vikhroli side, there's huge mangroves. Now, the entire mangrove land is owned by Godrej, and they have resisted all attempts to develop that into properties. Because that mangrove is a huge source of not just oxygen, but preserving biodiversity. It's a natural flood barrier. And, so all that was happening even before we were, the idea of carbon neutrality or emissions or, all this was there. So that commitment is what really, enticed me to work for that, after especially having been on the other side, but actually selling sustainability solutions. Now I'm more of a buyer of solutions. What I realized, in not just them, but if I look at Tatas and Mahindras, I think in the last 10 years, they've done all these bigger Indian conglomerates, most of them at least have done a fantastic job in terms of taking really ambitious targets for sustainability and then delivering on those. But there is a catch to it. When this is a question that was asked to me at a World Business Council for Sustainable Forum, the MC asked a very poignant question, which is, if all of you companies are saying you're doing such a good job, why are we still stuck in this situation? It's a fantastic question, because I think this is where now we've realized in the next phase of sustainability is we need to look at sustainability beyond our own operations. So we've started looking at the entire life cycle of all the products we use, and not looking at the process, but rather looking at the entire product. What I mean by that is, till now we're focused on within our factories, how do I reduce my greenhouse gas emissions? How do I increase renewable energy? How do I recycle more water and make sure that almost all of our facilities are now zero liquid discharge. We don't put in any water out. Almost all of it is recycled. But what I realize is that the bigger chunk, when we do these life cycle assessment studies, the bigger chunk of the impact actually happens in the entire value chain. Right from how that raw material is sourced, to how it's transported, to how the finished good is transported, to how the customer is using it, and then how the customer is disposing of it. I mean, just to give you an example, If you take Goodnight liquid vaporizer, the device, we have done a lot of effort towards like minimizing the amount of plastic used in it, to make it more energy efficient, the actual production of the device, to make sure that it meets certain disposal standards. What the life cycle assessment study for that product told us was that the biggest emitter of emissions in that product's life cycle is when you plug it in, and the amount of time you keep it plugged in, and the electricity it consumes for using that. So that was, it was a big eye opener for us, because we would never have thought that is the biggest emitter. And what that made us do is actually now rethink. Okay, we're like, okay, now our focus should be on how do we make something that consumes lesser energy while it's in use. How can I make something possibly that maybe runs on solar heat rather than through electricity? We've now developed something called a Goodnight Agarbatti, which basically is going back to the older days of just incense stick, which is actually a pesticide, and then you use that to kill mosquitoes. So that came about because we started looking at things outside our boundaries, and that is where I think we really, because we need to raise the floor all around us. Properties is a great example of that as well. Let's take most big developers today, and in fact, the property sector, what I would admire about them, is the real estate sector has very defined standards of what is a green product, what is not. You must have heard about platinum rated buildings or gold rated buildings or silver rated buildings. So there are very clear standards that say that only if you are environmentally very sound will we give you a platinum standard. Now, just like what you were talking about earlier, said about, don't leave your taps on. Now, what is the point of me building a really efficient water fitting or really, highly efficient 5-star air conditioner if you leave it on the entire day? So how do I change behavior? Now, that is the big question that, as corporates are facing. So behavior here in the properties, I've spoken about the customer side. Now, even at the building side, I want to now make sure my buildings are carbon neutral. Great. Do I know what the cement that I'm sourcing to make this is from a carbon neutral company? Do I know that the steel that I'm sourcing, because steel is a very, very carbon intensive product. You melt a lot of coal to make your steel. So that's where scope 3 emissions, which is what. So I don't want to go too technical, but so far scope 1 and scope 2 emissions basically your own emissions and from the power that you use. Scope 3 emissions talks about your entire value chain, from the raw material you procure to the distance that it travels. Which is why you hear about more and more people, even in the food sector, for example, saying eat locally, try not to have Norwegian salmon, because the carbon footprint of delivering the salmon from there to here is huge, which is not something that you consider.
Why salmon? Our apples, from apples and kiwi and everything comes from New Zealand.
Exactly.
And we've got apples which grow, in India here.
Absolutely. In the food and beverage sector, more and more modern chefs, are now saying, no, we must procure only locally within a 50-kilometer radius of where we are and only seasonally. So these are some of the examples of thinking beyond your operations, essentially.
But Ram, you mentioned about the behavior aspect, and that's the toughest part, I feel, educating people, especially in our current world, which we live of disposable stuff, which is everybody wants to cut costs, and the minute you need to buy a product cheaper, everybody's using more plastics. It's like use and throw. So that use and throw attitude of ours has got us into a lot of trouble over the last 20 or 30 years, I feel.
Yeah.
So how does a company like yours, do they also have like an outreach program where they work to educate people and to spread awareness of our behavior?
So you've actually really segued it beautifully from the last two. I was mentioning, you asked about what are the sustainability problems we're facing. So if I had to really pick the three ones, there have been carbon, which we spoke about, water, which we spoke about, and third is plastics. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I don't think plastic by itself is the problem. Let me tell you what I mean by that. I think plastic is a wonder material. It has literally pulled people out of poverty because of its uses in food storage, because of its durability, its cost compared to wood or steel, which were previously being used, which many people could not afford. I think plastic is a wonder material. The issue is two-pronged. One of which you mentioned, is the consumption patterns, which is, they're reducing in terms of, how the lifespan of products is reducing, and we are constantly looking to replace products rather than repair them nowadays.
Correct.
The other part of it, which is the biggest issue, is something which we call circularity, and lack of circularity in the plastics economy. What I mean by that is plastics itself, even the production and the material itself, a lot of people assume that plastic is difficult to degrade, so it's a problem. Plastic is not that difficult to degrade nowadays. It's, there are plenty of technologies available which convert plastics either into recycled plastics themselves. You can convert plastics to oil, which can be used in furnaces. You can even convert plastics into material for paver blocks, used in construction. And plastic pellets can be used as, a fuel in cement kilns, which is one of the biggest off-takers of plastic waste today. The problem is there is no efficient segregation and collection and delivery mechanism yet. And that is the biggest one. The problem is not the plastic itself. The problem is that the plastic is ending up in landfills rather than going back into the economy. So that's what we mean by lack of circularity. The loop is not getting closed. So it keeps ending up in landfills. And the biggest issue there is that the people who are working in the plastic sector are highly unorganized. They're not getting the real value for the work they do. They're really not neither given dignity of labor, nor are they given a true value for the kind of material they collect, nor are they organized in an effective manner. If we can try and solve this particular problem, and this is where industry and government as well as technology providers have to work together to really streamline this. There are a few companies doing good work in this. For example, I can give an example of what we are doing itself in Pondicherry. We've tied up with a company called Recity, who have a fantastic job they've done in other cities as well with other corporates in building efficient waste management systems. This is more from our CSR perspective. Building the entire waste management framework, which is no more dotted lines. You know exactly how much waste each household is producing. So you have the tracking of that. You can track it all the way to the recycler. You can calculate quantities. You can make sure that the people who are correcting it are getting a fixed wage and a correct amount of money for their work. So you're building an economy around it, and there is a lot of scope for that. We need to come up with, as corporates, have to come up with smarter models of delivery. What I mean by that, either we have mechanisms in which we can, for the higher value items, have a system. We tie up with Kirana stores or the larger, the chains like your Moores or your Big Bazaars to bring the plastic back, which we can then make sure it doesn't end up in the landfill and goes back into the system. Or the other way is looking at new vending models. Why do refills have to come in pouches? Why can't I have a vending machine where you can go and fill up your Surf or a Godrej product? You can just go there and fill up your detergent over.
The old Arvin milk booth.
In fact, when I was growing up, we used to go and fill milk in those booths. Plastic packet milk came much later. The problem is there again, quality control has to be very high. Hygiene has to be very high. You need to make sure, those things are maintained.
I shouldn't be lazy enough to get up early in the morning and go to the Arvin booth. I used to hate that show.
I think all of us used to hate that, but so rightly said, Ram. I mean, it is a behavioral thing, and I'm glad that brands are trying to do a lot of things to make that change, and Godrej is leading the way. That is quite amazing. We would love to hear more, but we'll take a quick break and be right back.
You're listening to the Odd Couple Podcast. A Pandemia Inc. production. Are you ready? A friendly fireside chat with friends where no topic is beyond a healthy discussion, punctuated with a laugh or two. Check it out! Tune in every fortnight on your favorite podcast network.
And welcome back to the Odd Couple Podcast. Today we have Ramnath Vaidyanathan, who is with the Godrej in the sustainability vertical of theirs and doing a lot of great work, which we've been hearing about. So Ram, we've heard about what the big corporate houses are doing. We hear what needs to be done in the agriculture. We know that plastics is not as evil as it is, and it's more of closing that particular loop. But the biggest question over here is, it's all about convenience, right? We live in a world where everything needs to be done in a jiffy. It needs to be convenient. It needs to be cheap. It needs to be cool. It needs to be futuristic. Predominantly, everybody wants to do that. But the solution seems to be going back to our origin, going back what used to be done earlier when we were growing up, like going to collecting the coconuts from the yard and going to the oil mill, crushing the oil and using the coconut oil to cook the food, or going to the farm, farming it and living off the fat of the land of sorts. And that is what sustainable development is, what you're talking about. So that's something which I want to talk to you about, where how do we be futuristic, be in the cusp of breaking technologies and stuff like that, but at the same time maintain this. How do you see that?
That's a very good question, because now what you mentioned is the same question that people had when renewable power first started, saying that, solar power is expensive, panels are expensive, the cost of going renewable is too high, power is intermittent, we only get it for a few hours a day. How do we solve this problem? This is not going to work for larger industries. What happens is that the technology eventually catches up with time. Today, solar power can be produced for lesser than coal. And what that doesn't take into even account is that the mitigation cost of later, trying to mitigate that carbon dioxide that's being produced from burning coal is not factored into your decision for switching back to that fossil fuel. So I think even and I'm a pragmatist. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm never going to advocate either change your convenience extremely or pay through your nose to go sustainable. That is not a solution for it. Now, electric vehicles is a beautiful example of this. We started off with these dinky little electric vehicles, which people said, hey, I'm never going to spend money on this. Why will I do this? It has a range of 60 kilometers. It took 10 years, but we have a Tesla now. We have a Hyundai Kona, which is made here. We have Tata's new vehicles, which are now going 300, 400, 420 kilometers on a single charge. And they're pretty good looking as well. I mean, it's not like you're not lacking anything in terms of features or you're not lacking in terms of style. So industry has to come up with, and it is, to its credit, it is coming up. Now, if you just take diesel engines as an example, you've never heard of diesel engines giving you the kind of mileages they give today. So as with any technology, even technology providers are constantly working towards making it more sustainable because they've understood that being sustainable is more cost effective in the long run. Nobody is doing it purely out of altruistic reasons. Let me be very honest with you. There is definitely a business value to be had from, which is why they're doing that. And all products will go through it. Now, you take batteries, for example. We're talking about, the phone battery itself in the time, let's not even take a big time frame. From the time when we started smartphones to now, we went from, less than 1,000 ampere batteries to now 4,000, 5,000 ampere batteries, which are in the same size. So those batteries have a longer life. So, which is why the industry's job to make solutions that are environment sustainable and yet do not give you any lack of quality in terms of the customer experience. And that is the crux of the question when I say new product development for sustainability. The first question that the NPD team or the new product development team, innovation team will ask, it should not change the customer experience. The customer experience should either be enhanced or should at least remain the same. Do not do anything that's going to change that. Most people, I still believe, you give them a viable alternative that doesn't sacrifice too much of their comforts and makes a reasonable cost point, will adopt that. And that's even truer of the current generation. I think current and future generation are much more aware and they're much more demanding of companies, not just on the environmental front, but from the social front as well. They want companies who are very clean about the human rights practices. You'll often see now, coffee chains are saying ethically sourced chocolate or ethically sourced coffee. Now that's part of sustainability. So they are questioning companies, and companies have gone from fearing them to realizing that, look, if we go sustainable, they can be our champions. You're getting free advertising for being a sustainable company. All you need is an influencer to pick that up and run with it. So on the whole, those products can be created and are being created, which do not sacrifice comfort for sustainability.
Also, I think in 2015, I think UN came up with 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, right? Out of which, and I think India was the first country which created a sustainability index, which within 3 or 4 years, we crossed the 50% mark. I think states like Kerala, Tamil Nadu, not too sure which the third one is, well into the 60, 70% types. I mean, those, just for our listeners, these sustainable SDGs set by the UN and adopted by 193 countries across the globe, which India is a signatory to, is to basically cut down or achieve these SDG goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, by the year 2030. And India is well on its way to achieving that, hopefully, and they keep consistently do that. So these SDGs are basically stuff like alleviation of poverty, access to clean drinking water. Ram, help me out because there's quite a few.
there's quite a bit. There's access, opportunity for employment,
equality.
The SDGs pretty much cover every living condition on the planet. The only problem I have with judging things on the SDG index is that the SDGs look more at breadth rather than depth.
Okay.
It speaks about how many more goals can I touch rather than how deep into each of those goals do I go into. So it's a great framework to set your goals. But I think what really needs to be studied is how deep you've gone into. When you can say, okay, access to clean water for all. All is a very subjective thing, and how do you define access? How do you define access to power? So typically in India, for example, access to power is defined as if your village has an electrical pole and there are wires connecting it to the grid. Now, whether electricity is reaching the household, that is not really the metric that's considered. So I think we need to relook, or we have to be very smart, and we have to hold our regulators accountable on this information, on these metrics, because they can be very misleading. You can say 97% electrified, but what you really need to understand, how many households are electrified and how many households receive electricity on a regular basis.
Right, without power cuts,
Yeah, it's like the joke about, you build a railway station, but if no train comes into town, what's the point of the railway station? So it's the same logic, So, but the SDGs are great film, and India, I must say, despite the fact that we're not as developed as some of the Western nations, we have been very ambitious and very aggressive in our pursuit of sustainability. I mean, all credit due to all the policymakers. We've taken up very ambitious goals, be it in renewable energy, be it in the reduction of emissions. And I think that definitely needs to be commended. But where we need to really, I think a little bit more push is required. This is something we were speaking about earlier. As you mentioned about these goals, and I think it's important now. We've had 10 years of setting targets. We had 10 years of committing to Paris, committing to SDGs. We've had that. What we need is 10 years of action, and that action, second point, is public disclosure. We need companies to be very transparent and public with disclosing their environmental impact through the Climate Disclosure Project or any other indices. And I think the more transparency is there, that goes a long way towards motivating other people as well as setting higher bars and higher standards. What is happening today is that a lot of smaller companies, they say, oh, we've taken up a renewable energy target, but we don't publicly disclose it. That doesn't really help anyone. So I think that being very transparent in your disclosure, and I say this at this time because July end is the disclosure period for almost all the global indices, and we've taken up some indices in this year which even we weren't sure about the data gaps. But it's important for us to even do that publicly so that we know where the areas of concern are in which we have to act. So I think that'll go a long way towards even reaffirming the faith, because a lot of people have become a little bit cynical about the environmental. It's almost confused with activism, for example, or it's said that people are doing dharnas all the time. And so I think we need to get their confidence back.
No, but Ram, see, you talked about setting these targets and disclosure from the point of view of the company, but for me, it's always been that who's holding these people accountable, right? Is it the policymakers, the government? And if it's the government who's supposed to, does it really happen in India? Because like you take the Ganges and the amount of pollution over there, and a lot of it is from a lot of industries. And we know the problem is that, but how much do we hold these companies accountable for what they're doing?
No, that's a very important point you made. And that's why I'm saying disclosure has to be transparent and on a global standard. It cannot be, I will disclose in my own manner, you will disclose in your own manner, and we'll all, so I'll withhold certain information. That's why I'm saying everybody has to commit to, it's like you do your income taxes. You can't have a separate way of calculating one person, a separate way for another person. And what I would say is the biggest issue is that a lot of people are so worried about what might be exposed about their environmental performance that they don't bother disclosing. We played it pretty soft so far. It's all been, the guys who are disclosing are the ones who are overperforming. Let's just put it this way.
Correct,
all the top companies, your Tatas, Godrejes, your Mahindras, we've taken up targets which are much higher than the minimum requirements. We have ambition. So even if we falter, say if I'm supposed to achieve 100% of that target, even if I get to 80%, that's way higher than what is expected of us. These are all voluntary targets. So that's great. But the point is, when you start off in the system, you can't have a carrot and stick approach, because punitive things does not work at the early stages of getting people to adopt. It has to be very friendly, very gentle approach where you're saying, look, let's help you out. Let's incentivize you to become sustainable. But I think now in the first phase of this next journey, we need to start incentivizing good behavior, if not necessarily penalizing bad behavior. But in the next 10 years, we need to have stronger penalties for bad behavior, and that's non-negotiable. And that's what EU did as well. Eventually, their regulations have become so strong that the entire floor of the industry has raised.
I can't agree more, because I think a parallel taken, since we're talking about electric vehicles earlier, the Indian government and the Ministry of Roads and Transport, they said, okay, every year you have this BS4, BS6, which is from an environment perspective. But what a lot of people weren't talking about was safety. Not that government has said, oh, safety, you need to have 5-star rating, 3-star rating. No, but companies like the Tatas, as well as Toyotas and Mahindras also, came up and said, listen, global NCAP, we are 5-star. Or we have global NCAP rating, we are 4-star. And I made a decision of buying a car of Tatas purely because it was safer than a Kia, which wasn't even tested. Or it was tested in NCAP Asian, but the manufacturing, they're using different forms of manufacturing in India, which does not have those same standards of safety. And I think once this conversation keeps happening, and as companies keep talking, I think companies need to speak more about it and keep waving this flag until you get noticed. And people will notice. And people will realize, what, I need to keep my family safe, hence I will choose a safer car. Now, this has been happening for a few years, but it takes time. And I think even companies like Tata's and Mahindra should, and Godrej also, but we don't hear too much on this. Why is that?
I think it's a very good analogy you brought up, because it's one of the biggest reasons for that, again, is that more and more companies are on global financial indices as well. So the pressure from external investors and investors who are not based in India is extremely high on many of these companies, including Godrej. We get constant investor calls from Europe or from Singapore, from Hong Kong, who want to know what we're doing on the ESG front. In fact, I would go as far as saying almost 50% of all investor relation calls that we take, the 50% of the content of the call is about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. The financial aspect is only the remaining 50%. So clearly it's become very, very important. And one other very good point you made, Sid, is that, there is a tendency to view developing countries as markets which will consume unsustainable products because they have a cost implication. And I think that is slowly changing, because I think there's an entire segment of customers in developing economies who are demanding, like, we don't want the junk of the world. We want to make sure our products are also ethically sourced. We want to make sure our products are also made in an environmentally friendly manner. That's changing. So I think companies who are coming into India can't take that for granted anymore. And one of the other issues is also that I think companies have done a great job in doing, but I think they need to do a lot more work in mentoring, especially in the SMEs. Now, which is what something we're doing as part of our sustainable supply chain policy, is that every year we onboard a certain fixed number of suppliers or vendors in our supply chain into our sustainability program. And we sort of spend the entire year educating them on best practices. We even, in fact, go look at the facility and say how they can become better. And I think that is where the job of the larger corporates is also in profiling their good work. And I think that is something where we've been lacking. We have tried to change that a little bit. Now, for example, I don't know if you know about this, but last year, Godrej came up with a very revolutionary product called Mr. Magic. It was a powder-based hand wash. What essentially it does is you buy the small refill sachet. It's the size of a candy bar you used to get. That's how small it is. And you fill the powder back into your old bottle, which we're using for soap dispensing, and you fill it with water. And it becomes a soap solution.
Wow.
So what that does is it reduced our plastic packaging by about 70%. So this was a sustainable product. But I myself was very taken aback that the sustainability angle of the product wasn't the marketing peg around. That wasn't, there wasn't much push around.
Yeah, I never heard about it.
That's the thing. For some reason, it's not as big an issue as some of the other things like price points. Now, for example, the thing on any product, now even plywood says we're 99% virus proof, which is, I don't understand how that point that made, but it's about what people want out of a product right now. So that's the thing. It has become. I recently saw. I remember Kent RO last year made a product saying that it is vegetarian water because it removes every microbe. I'm like, that's not how it works at all. And having microbe-free water is not good for you. You need bacteria in your gut. So marketing is a completely different thing. So I think sustainability marketing is an entire domain which needs to be built up. I think it's still very, very early days. We still haven't figured out how, because we still, as on that cusp, not knowing whether the customer is really bought into that or not. Now, if you see the real high-end customers, your customers who buy Body Shop or say Lush, rather than buy Godrej or Synthol soap or any other soap, those companies are targeting saying that, organically sourced or, there's no deforestation involved in this product, because that's a segment of customer they know is willing to pay that premium for that product. But the bottom of the pyramid customer, we're not yet sure.
But the point is, again, it comes back to marketing, comes back to communication. If you have Shah Rukh Khans and Ranbir Kapoors and your brand ambassadors, and if you decide, listen, this is going to be the hero and this is going to be the crux of our communication. But what I'm going to say is, once you have Shah Rukh Khans and the worlds talking about it, and every ad is just talking about this, and suddenly Tatas will come and say, oh, Godrej is doing that, I will try and do one up on them. Then Nike will do it in a different way. And then suddenly everybody, and that's what happened to my earlier point which I was making, which is the global NCAP rating, safety, because everybody started talking about it. If I talk about it, you're forced to talk about it. Now, if I keep quiet, I choose not to talk about it.
I think it's a perception thing, Sid. It's in every sector. One of my other hobbies in life is, the home brewing. We've always been into this craft beer and home brewing scene for the longest time. And for the longest time, it was very difficult to convince people that Indians would be adventurous in how they would drink beer. And nobody bought it. It's like, no, we won't like bitter stuff. Indians don't like all this. But it has changed. I think we, as a tendency, tend to underestimate the Indian consumer. We think that they are not as informed. We think they make choices purely on cost. We think they make choices purely on factors which is really not true. The customer has evolved tremendously. And I, for one, you're absolutely right. We have to start somewhere by, pushing the sustainability as a part of marketing. And it's very, very important. It's something where I'm trying to drive very heavily within the Godrej Group. In fact, one of our goals for the next 5 years is purely consumer focus. It's about how do we increase awareness among consumers about sustainability and sustainable products. And so it is bound to happen, and we want to be at the forefront rather than a laggard in this.
That's when your parents will be really proud of you that you took this field.
Hopefully. I still remember when I started off in this, they were like, oh, environment, why not oil and gas? Why not rubber? Because I was a chemical engineer, and it was very difficult to convince people that this was a field. But now, if you see, it's ridiculous amount of, on LinkedIn requests I get from young kids who are looking to get into sustainability, and they're asking for career advice or mentorship and how they should do it. I mean, it's phenomenal. And I think a lot more, universities and colleges are offering courses geared towards sustainability as well. So I think that's a really good sign.
Yeah, absolutely, Ram. It's so nice to hear that the younger generation are reaching out and there are colleges who are offering courses in sustainability and allied fields. And yes, brands are doing the best they can. But I think it's also, as you said, it's up to the consumer to be conscious about it, be aware about this. Because before starting this podcast, I will be brutally honest, I didn't know too much about sustainability except for the sprinkling on top, just like the basic. But after thinking, there's a lot to think about, to be honest. And It's very easy to be responsible. It's just question of wanting to be responsible. I think that is the difference, the way I see it. So thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Ram, so much for joining the Odd Couple podcast.
My pleasure.
It was an absolutely thought-provoking discussion and a fun discussion as always that we've had many, many times. Obviously, thank you, Dr. Ashish, who's my partner in crime as always. And thank you to all our listeners who took their time out for today to listen to us. Keep tuning in, keep sharing our episodes if you like them, and do reach out to us at any time. And we'll have Ram's LinkedIn as well as other social handles in the show notes. Thank you so much. You're listening to the Odd Couple podcast. Bye-bye.